Happy Saturday, and thank you for joining me today. In 2004, Republican President George W. Bush defeated his Democratic opponent John Kerry and was reelected for another 4 years. President Bush was also reelected with a Republican-controlled House and Senate. In fact, Republicans gained more seats in both the House and the Senate that year. But the following year was just an absolute disaster, specifically in August of 2005. Hurricane season usually begins on June 1st and ends on November 30th. In 2005, there was a very active hurricane season, but then August came, and on August 25th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit the Florida coast as a Category 1 with winds of 80 miles per hour. Florida's Governor Jeb Bush declared a state of emergency. The following day, Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco declared a state of emergency, and the White House deployed National Guard troops to the Gulf Coast. By 10:30 that morning, Katrina has strengthened to a Category 2. The next day at about 5 p.m., the mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, started a voluntary evacuation of New Orleans metro area residents. On the evening of August 27, 2005, Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour declared a state of emergency. The next day, Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 with winds of 175 miles per hour. That same day, all residents in New Orleans were ordered to evacuate. For those who were unable to evacuate, for those who were unable to leave, the city opened shelters for them. The Superdome was one of those mass shelters for people who were unable to evacuate the hurricane. At 6 a.m. on August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall as a Category 3 on the Gulf Coast. Then, at approximately 9 a.m., a levee was breached in the lower 9th Ward, and more breaks were subsequently reported. Water began rushing into the eastern New Orleans, the lower 9th Ward, and St. Bernard Parish. Thousands of people were trapped on rooftops and in attics. Many homes had been submerged, and 80% of the city was underwater. That afternoon, Hurricane Katrina had ripped a hole in the Superdome, which put many sheltered victims at risk. Later on, President George W. Bush declared an emergency disaster for the states of Louisiana and Mississippi. Katrina then downgraded back to a tropical storm while passing over the state of Tennessee. But the damage on the Gulf Coast was horrific and just immense. In Mississippi, coastal towns had been eradicated, and hundreds of people were believed to be dead. The city of New Orleans was left without electricity and drinking water. And many residents were still stranded on rooftops, and that's when we began seeing remarkable footage of national television of people waving umbrellas and holding up signs that say, "Help us." People were desperately waiting for rescue as the situation just intensified. Bodies were floating in the streets, looting occurred, thousands of people began traveling to the Superdome in hope of being evacuated. At the Superdome, the conditions were essentially not safe. People lacked food, water, and sanitation. The death toll continued to rise exponentially and eventually settled at 1,800 people. Here was a CBS News special report at the time.
The governor of Louisiana said today that she is considering the remarkable step of evacuating the remaining residents of New Orleans. A water main broke, leaving New Orleans without drinking water, and the flooding here is getting worse after waters from Lake Pontchartrain broke through a levee. And with much of New Orleans now underwater, authorities are focused on search and rescue before it's too late.
If ever the cavalry was needed, it is now, and it is in New Orleans. An Army National Guard helicopter today rescued people from rooftops, fragile islands in the floodwaters. It was the Coast Guard to the rescue for others, swinging axes to reach people trapped in attics. In one submerged neighborhood, they plucked people to safety one by one with a helicopter-borne basket. An air-sea rescue in the heart of urban America. And when you pull back for a wide shot, the scene is nothing short of apocalyptic. 80% of New Orleans, including much of downtown, is underwater. The Big Easy's famous Canal Street, living up to its name. And rising waters will now force officials to evacuate the shelter at the Superdome. Katrina's departure was just the beginning of the misery.
I didn't think it was over, but I didn't think it would come to this.
But it has come to this. People are now living in parking garages. Others picked up what they could and moved to higher ground on the interstate. Refugees in their own hometown.
We're not able to get up and just go. We don't have transportation. I mean, we live in paycheck to paycheck. I mean, it ain't like we could just able to get up and just leave.
It was all enough to bring Louisiana's governor to tears today.
The magnitude of the situation is untenable. It's just heartbreaking.
New Orleans is called the Big Bowl, a lake to the north, a river to the south, and canals on both sides. Most of the land in between is below sea level. When Katrina breached the levees that held the water back, the bowl was swamped. And in the poorer neighborhoods of that bowl, people who could least afford it have lost the most. Water is still head high, swamping everything in sight. Every rescue boat that goes out comes back heavy with human cargo. One crew had to break open the front of this house to get to a woman who had been trapped in her attic for 2 days. And they will be at it for days to come.
Rescue workers first started plying these waters shortly after the winds of Hurricane Katrina died down on Monday afternoon. They worked all night, through the night, and into the morning. It's now about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they say they've picked up about 1,000 people so far. And there could still be hundreds more out here.
Remarkably, some people refuse to be rescued. Better off, they feel, on their own front porch than looking for shelter elsewhere.
You don't want anybody to pick you up?
No, we want to put the pumps on.
Put the pumps on.
Put the pumps on. Get the water out of here. Get the water out.
But the pumps aren't coming on. There's no electricity. And even if there was, the levees haven't been repaired yet. Officials are overwhelmed by the scope of this disaster. They can't even pick up dead bodies. There is nowhere to put them. And people who now have nothing and no place to go swear they've rode out their last hurricane.
We leaving next time. They can say a windstorm, just a flood or whatever, anything. We gone.
Late today, the mayor of New Orleans said it could be 2 to 4 weeks before people are allowed back downtown. He says that it's going to take at least 2 weeks to deal with all of the water here and getting the electricity back on, a month or more. He also said today there are significant casualties.
Once again, that was a CBS News special report on the situation in Louisiana as Hurricane Katrina just left devastation as the levees breached and the water was just all over the city of New Orleans. Many people asked, how could this happen in the United States of America? That couldn't conceivably happen here, but it did, and the damage was catastrophic. And it was because of the cataclysmic failure of one administration, the cataclysmic failure of leadership from the federal government. The Bush administration attempted to blame local and state officials for the unmitigated disaster, in particular, the governor of Louisiana. While people were dying and stranded from Hurricane Katrina, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice decided it'd be a great idea to go on vacation. She writes in her memoir years later, quote, "I flew to New York. That evening, upon arriving at the Palace Hotel, I flipped on the television. Indeed, the hurricane had hit New Orleans. I called Secretary of Homeland Security Mike Chertoff, inquiring if there was anything I could do. Quote, it's pretty bad, he said. We discussed the question of foreign help briefly, but Mike was clearly in a hurry. He said he'd call back if he needed me. I hung up, got dressed, and went to see Spamalot." Spamalot was the Monty Python musical, and people were astonished to see her laughing it up as the Gulf Coast was in tatters. Not a good time to go on vacation. The New York Daily News writes, quote, Secretary Rice was booed by some audience members at Spamalot, the Monty Python musical at the Schubert Theater, when the lights went up after the performance. End quote. Apparently that didn't wake her up. Should I really be here while people are stranded and dying on the Gulf Coast? Secretary Rice then went shoe shopping which provoked the encounter between her and a fellow shopper. Gawker reports, quote, a fellow shopper unable to fathom the absurdity of Rice's timing went up to the secretary and reportedly shouted, quote, how dare you shop for shoes while thousands are dying? The article continues, never one to have her fashion choices questioned, Rice had security physically remove the woman, end quote. Secretary Rice later denied that anybody actually yelled that at her in the store, but she did confirm in her memoir that she was shopping for shoes. She also said that she regretted all of it, writing in her memoir, quote, I sat there kicking myself for having been so tone deaf. What had I been thinking? End quote. Also, pictures later surfaced of President George Bush having a great time vacationing in Texas, playing the guitar and eating cake. I'm sure that was nice. The devastation was so bad that the following year, the White House conducted an internal report, as well as the Senate and the House. The House released their report first, which drew lots of attention. But the Democrats thought it would be the Democrats thought the report would be partisan because Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate. However, it was completely the opposite. It was completely the opposite of what they expected. This is the headline at the New York Times. Quote, Republicans' report on Katrina assails the administration response. End quote. It then follows with this lead. Quote, House Republicans plan to issue a blistering report on Wednesday that says the Bush administration delayed the evacuation of thousands of New Orleans residents by failing to act quickly on early reports that the levees had broken during Hurricane Katrina. End quote. When House Republicans released their report, here's what it says. Quote, Perhaps the single most important piece of information during Katrina was confirmation of the levee breaches in New Orleans. Beyond the importance of the information itself, the implications of the information determined whether or not Katrina would be just another bad storm in New Orleans or the nation's worst case hurricane disaster. Because the Department of Homeland Security failed to anticipate the likely consequences of the storm and procure the buses, boats, and aircraft that were ultimately necessary to evacuate the flooded city prior to Katrina's landfall, the next critical decision point of the federal response became confirmation of the levee breaches. If the levees breached and flooded a large portion of the city, then the flooded city would have to be completely evacuated. And delay in confirming the breaches would result in a delay in the post-landfall evacuation of the city. End quote. New York Times reporter Eric Lipton reported that the White House knew about the levee's failure on the night of the storm. Nevertheless, administration officials were doing this. Quote, the vice president is still fly fishing in Wyoming. The president's chief of staff is still in Maine. End quote. We later then got reports from the New York Times as well, from the New York Times, which provided their source for this reporting, the Associated Press. Quote, video shows Bush was warned before Katrina. Here's the headline. Quote, in dramatic and sometimes agonizing terms, federal disaster officials warned President Bush and his Homeland Security chief before Hurricane Katrina struck that the storm could breach levees, put lives at risk in the New Orleans Superdome, and overwhelm rescuers, according to confidential video footage. Bush didn't ask a single question during the final briefing before Katrina struck on August 29th, but he assured soon-to-be battered state officials, saying, quote, we are fully prepared, end quote. The Bush administration's horrible response to Hurricane Katrina later helped the president's approval ratings tank. So that was 15 years ago. Of course, we are now in the midst of a very different crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, which continues to ravage the nation. Today, the U.S. reported 99,000 coronavirus cases. The situation here is just absolutely dire. Earlier this week, we reached 9 million coronavirus cases. As of today, the death toll in the U.S. from the coronavirus pandemic is more than 230,000 dead Americans who could have been alive today. or at least half of those, or at least just a half of the number of those Americans who are dead could have been alive today. We have reached an astonishing point in this nation. Cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are continuing to rise. But we are here because of the cataclysmic failure of the Trump administration's response and the Trump administration's leadership on this crisis. The president's downplaying of this pandemic, referring to it as a, quote, Democratic hoax, end quote, back in February really didn't help. Thenceforth politicizing it and continuing with the politicization even after he himself has tested positive. And, they are still holding rallies today as our situation exacerbates. Rallies with people coming together, rallies with people being congregated in these outside places. And the Trump administration really has no excuse. In March, Politico reported that before Donald Trump even became president, 7 days before the Trump inauguration, before he became our nation's 44th president of the United States, thenceforth beginning his first term in office, before Donald Trump even became president, he and incoming administration officials were briefed on a potential pandemic by the Obama administration. It was a warning. They were told that this would be, quote, the worst influenza pandemic since 1918. End quote. Since 1918. 1918, ultimately 675,000 Americans died because President Woodrow Wilson never publicly addressed the crisis. And that's how that pandemic got out of control. They were warned of this. And what did they do? Well, the Baltimore Sun gives the answer to that question, and it also provides some historical context. Quote, remember after Bill Clinton built up the Federal Emergency Management Agency's capacity? Well, George W. Bush appointed cronies with no disaster relief experience to run the agency. First as campaign manager Joe Alba, and then the hapless Michael Brown, whose, quote, qualification, end quote, was running the International Arabian Horse Association. Plus, Mr. Brown's two top aides were Bush campaign operatives. So FEMA became a shell of its old self. Its response to Katrina was marked by lethal delays, mismanagement, and blame shifting. The people of New Orleans were abandoned by their federal government. Similarly, after Barack Obama strengthened the U.S. public health infrastructure in the wake of the H1N1 and Ebola outbreaks in 2009 and in 2014, respectively, President Donald Trump tore it down. He slashed the number of Centers for Disease Control and Prevention epidemiologists in China from 47 to 14, according to Reuters. He closed all the National Science Foundation foreign offices and ignored the comprehensive pandemic playbook Obama prepared. End quote. So, why not? Just slash it. Take everything apart. We don't need that pandemic. We'll never have a pandemic. We are a large country. More than 230,000 people are dead now from the coronavirus pandemic. More than 9 million Americans are infected, which means more than 9 million Americans now have a pre-existing condition. Coronavirus cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are continuing to rise here in the United States, and it is all because of the cataclysmic failure of the response and leadership from this administration. As I say, as is often reported, we are now 3 days away from the presidential election, where you as an American citizen will have the chance to re-elect the current president of the United States or to elect a new president. That is one of our rudimentary rights in a democratic republic. Elect or re-elect. It is your decision as an American. But as we are going into this presidential election, as we are going into election day, we are not only just watching for seats, we're not only just watching the presidential election, we're also watching senators and and members of the House being potentially reelected or elected too. I mean, this is a very, very critical election We are now 3 days away from one of the most consequential elections in American history. We are also now concerned about election day violence or post-election day violence as results begin to come in. Also on election night, if you are watching, do not be alarmed. Do not be terrified when no results are coming in. Or we still have mail-in ballots to count. That will definitely be the case on election night as well. So a winner may not be declared on election night, so that is nothing to be alarmed about. It's going to be completely normal. This is a completely different and unprecedented election in American history. So watch out for this. As I have said, we are now 3 days away from this presidential election. If you have already voted, encourage others in your family and friend group to vote as well if they have not voted. If you are still holding an absentee ballot, make sure to turn it in. It is now, officials and experts are now saying, as of now, it is too late to physically mail it in. To physically mail it. You now have to turn it in because it's just too late. I was thinking about covering all the scandals under this administration and sort of putting all of that into context and doing that for one show or for a monologue, but no, it's honestly just too much. There's too much that this administration has done. There's too much reprehensible actions this administration has committed and crimes this administration has committed. The President of the United States and other cabinet officials, lots of people resigning. Remember everything that this administration did as you go to the polls. The corruption, the mismanagement of the coronavirus pandemic, and the mismanagement of other things. The president's racism and other things that have transpired under this administration that sometimes made you feel sort of in despair and unsettled as an American citizen watching the current presidency. And yes, you do have the right to feel unsettled in that righteous anger from the other things that have transpired under the Trump administration. For instance, the family separation policy. The family separation policy where they are separating children from their parents, babies from their mothers at the southern border. We have an active live TJPS special report still transpiring. I did not get part 2 to you yesterday, but we are working on that right now. But this administration cannot compete with any other president for the level of corruption and the level of resignations and the level of scandals. It is just absolutely unsettling. One of the worst crises, or sort of the worst events that has transpired under this administration and in history since 1918 is the coronavirus pandemic. Now, looking at this from a political point, it may have been politically advantageous if the president handled this pandemic with more sympathy, but he has not. And just as history judged President George W. Bush on his handling of Hurricane Katrina and the federal response being so botched and terrible and incompetent and feckless, history will also judge President Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic and the millions of Americans that became infected and the hundreds of thousands of Americans that died. History will judge the president for that. Right now in the United States, things do not appear to be getting better. In fact, they are getting worse. Today, we reported 99,000 coronavirus cases. Hospitalizations are rising all over the country. And right now, we are on track for a very, very dark winter. We have much more ahead tonight. Stay with us on the Jeremiah Patterson Show. We'll be right back.